Hello everyone, welcome to this AKD interview. My name is Pablo Policastro. I am member of the Argentinian Sports Physical Therapy Association, better now as AKD. As you know, AKD has been working with JOSPT, promoting their researches in Latin American speakers. Recently, we translated to Spanish the JOSPT guideline, exercise-based knee and anterior cruciate ligament injury prevention. And today we have the honor to talk about with the main author of this research. Just to introduce Amy, she's a physical therapist from the United States with a big expertise like clinicians and researchers in sports, especially in knee. She worked as physio in Brooklyn Nets, and currently she moved to Austria for working in the Red Bull Performance Center. I have much more for saying about Amy, but I just want to say one more thing. Besides, she's a great physio. She's the first person that I admit that plays Aussie rules. Please enjoy her. Welcome, Amy. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor.
Thank you, Amy. We know that you are a busy person living in a new country, so we are really excited for having you. You know, Amy, in this chat, we want to ask you some questions specifically about your guideline, but also about the importance of this kind of research. Are you ready?
Ready.
Okay, here we go. Firstly, I am going to start asking you about the importance of clinical guidelines in general. In your opinion, why the physical therapist should use clinical practice guidelines in their patient care?
So I think clinical practice guidelines are really important, not only because they're a synthesis of all of the evidence, so bringing together many, many different papers, whether those be meta-analyses or systematic reviews or case studies, it's bringing them all together in one place. But it's also evaluating those studies on their quality. So looking at, okay, we might have a meta-analysis, but that might not be a very good meta-analysis. It might have a lot of bias. And so bringing all of those pieces together to essentially grade the evidence and say, yes, we have good evidence that we should follow some of these things, or maybe we don't have as good evidence as we thought for doing other things. It's a really good way to, in one place, find a lot of information on one topic. And so, you know, as physios, we are really busy throughout the day, and we don't have time to go and read every article that comes out. And so clinical practice guidelines become this really nice place to go to say, here's the best evidence that we have. Here's a quick summary that I can read in, 5-10 minutes, or go to when I have that patient to say, okay, what do I need to know? What do I need to kind of refresh myself on? And it's all right there, instead of having to spend hours and hours and hours reading lots of different papers or trying to find different papers. So the goal is really to make it easy for a clinician and have this one place you can go for the best evidence.
Thank you, Amy. One more, could you briefly explain the development of the recommendations? How do they graduate?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of a multi-step process. The first step is to do a really big search. So we set out terms that we decide ahead of time, and we search multiple databases. So not just PubMed, but we look across multiple databases. We take all of the articles that search finds, and we go through by title and see what fits our criteria. So for example, with this clinical practice guideline, we had to be very specific. So there's lots of research on injury prevention programs that affect risk factors for knee injuries. So for example, maybe they affect strength or they affect biomechanics. In this case, we had to say, okay, to make our practice guidelines really succinct, we're only going to look at what programs influence injuries. not risk factors. So we go through and we sift through all of those articles, and it's a lot of articles. It's, I think we just did the search for the update, and I think even that had like 17,000 articles.
It's a lot.
So we screen through based on title and information. And once we get that kind of smaller list, then we look at the abstract and we say, what abstracts fit our criteria? That makes a much smaller list. Once we have those, then we'll read the whole paper and we say, does this paper fit our criteria? So once we've narrowed it down and we've gotten only the papers that fit our criteria, then we go through and we pull out the information from that article, and we also rate it based on its quality. So we look at the risk of bias, whether that be, was the paper blinded if it's a randomized control trial? Did the authors state their conflicts of interest? Maybe you have an author who's working for a company that put on this program, things that might bias how they report their results. So we not only just pull the information out, but we rate how those articles are with regards to bias or regards to quality. And we actually, in this guideline, set a criteria that the articles have to be above a particular level quality. So we just, really low level articles, we actually just took out. So we rate them based on quality, we pull out all of their information, and then we bring all of that together to say, okay, we have one article that looks at maybe the FIFA 11 plus. We have another article that also looks at the FIFA 11 plus, maybe a third article that looks at the knee control program. And so then once we've got all of that information, we put it together and kind of summarize those articles, as well as give it a kind of quality rating for, how good is the evidence behind either this particular program or this program in a particular group. So good example in this guideline is young women. We have lots of information on young women. We don't have very much information on young men. So summarizing that information, that then goes into the guidelines. Excellent. And then the next step is it gets updated. So every 5 years, the guidelines get updated. So we're actually in the process right now of starting that update. So even though it was 2018 that the first guidelines were published, we're hoping within the next year or two that we'll have an update to publish to say, okay, here's the guidelines, here's what's happened since then.
Since the publication of the guideline, have you seen, for example, new researches? Have you seen many changes?
There hasn't been a ton of changes, actually. It's actually really interesting is that there actually really hasn't been a lot of new updates. I think there's been a lot of research, but not a lot that has fit into the criteria of this clinical practice guideline. So I think we are learning more, but it's in different areas. So it's in areas, say, of risk factors for ACL injury prevention. And I think there's also been some information with regards to compliance with prevention programs or implementation. Some of that fits into these guidelines. Some of it, unfortunately, does not. So the update will have some of that piece and some won't be.
Excellent, Amy. So now link it maybe the importance of this type of research with the clinical practice. Do you think that the benefits for patients by basing treatments on the recommendation of clinical practice guidelines could be better? Do they have measured clinical improvements?
Yeah, so I think, in this case, the biggest clinical improvements we see are less injuries. We see fewer ACL injuries. So for example, if we're looking at a soccer team or a football team, their biggest outcome measure is going to be keeping athletes healthy, is going to be not having ACL injuries. And since ACL injuries in particular have such a devastating impact, both on the player, but also on the team as a whole, I think this guideline especially has a really big and sometimes maybe easy outcome measure
Yes.
in that case. So it can become, a little more evident that, an injury prevention program is working as clubs and teams start to see fewer injuries.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. In your opinion, what are the main difficulties or obstacles that physical therapists have for its implementation?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot. This is not it's not something that we can put into our clinical practice really quickly. And that's partly because we have to work with other people. We have to work with coaches. In some cases, we have to work with strength and conditioning coaches. And so convincing, especially coaches, that this is something that's really important can be difficult. So some of the tactics that I've used are helping coaches understand the benefits beyond injury prevention. So these programs are going to help your player potentially get stronger. They may get faster. They may have better balance. And by them understanding those performance benefits, they sometimes are more likely to say, okay, yeah, let's maybe put this in. There's some new evidence coming out from Holly Silvers that says teams that actually performed the 11 plus actually won more games. And that's an easy sell for coaches. Coaches often want results and clubs want results. So if you can come in and say, well, if you do this prevention program, you may actually win more, or at least you may lose less, suddenly you've got someone's attention. But also then working with coaches or players or strength and conditioning coaches to say, what are the exact obstacles you face? So my favorite example of this is from Bath University in the UK. And they were actually trying to implement a program in rugby players. So you'll enjoy this. So in the UK, during rugby season, it rains a lot.
Yes.
So it's pretty cold and it's pretty wet. And they couldn't figure out why these athletes didn't want to do this program. And finally, they sat down with them and the athletes said, well, this program has a lot of things that you make us lie down in the grass. And it's cold and it's wet. And so as we're warming up, the last thing we want to do is lie in the cold, wet grass. And the researchers went, oh, well, that's easy.
Yes.
So having these conversations, sometimes it's an obvious obstacle, but if you're not communicating about what that obstacle is, you might not recognize it. So I think that's recognizing what those obstacles are and having conversations around how do you approach them or get over them is really essential.
So maybe putting attention in this last answer, maybe your message for clinicians about maybe sometimes we have difficulties in the relation about the view of PT and the view of the coach. What is your message? Just talking about, for example, with the coach that if you do it, you're gonna win much more. How is the message?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to building a relationship with that person. You have to have some trust, then that coach has to trust you as well. So having a relationship. I can't come in as a new physio to a coach who I don't know very well and just go, all right, this is what we're going to do. End of story. We have to have a conversation and there has to be a little bit of give and take. So I have to listen to that coach and that coach's needs. So that maybe he or she wants more technical aspects. They want a ball involved. Okay, that's easy. I can integrate that. But if I just come in and say, this is what we're doing, that coach automatically is going to be defensive and they're going to say no.
Mm.
So we have to build that communication. We have to build that trust to say, okay, I'm working with you. You're working with me. This is a two-way street in a way. We're both giving, we're both taking, we're compromising, and we're communicating. So I think that's the foundation for having a good working relationship. But it's also, I think, the foundation for getting buy-in on how do we start to get some of these prevention programs implemented in a team setting.
Excellent, excellent. So fortunately, there is a strong evidence about exercise-based knee injury prevention programs. So do you have a preference for a prevention program, or you prefer to choose a program designed by you?
So I think it depends on the situation. I think the programs that we have in the literature are very good, and we've got really good evidence behind them. But they don't fit every situation. You know, if you're working with a football team or a soccer team, you know, that's great. We've got good evidence behind the 11 plus or the knot control program. But if you're working with a basketball team, if you're working with a volleyball team, maybe you're working with an Australian rules football team, you know, we don't have as good literature there. And so that's where I think it takes some of our clinical expertise to tailor those programs to those sports. You know, there's some sports that we just actually, myself, Holly Silvers, and Greta Michaelburst just wrote an article for the Journal of Orthopedic Research, kind of identifying some of the areas where we need more research, kind of where there are gaps in the prevention literature. And we definitely have some sports. Netball is one of them. Australian rules football is one of them, as well as some of the individual sports like skiing and snowboarding or gymnastics, wrestling. Some of these maybe smaller sports, they need prevention programs because they have very high ACL injury incidence, but we don't have set programs for them yet. And so working with athletes, working with coaches, using our own clinical expertise is where, you know, we really need to kind of tailor to that athlete or that team to be able to come up with something that will work well for them.
Excellent, excellent. Amy, as you said, compliance is very important to follow a prevention program. What strategies you use to promote compliance?
Yeah, I think one big piece, and we've already talked about it, is having a coach kind of on board, the coach understanding, but also having players understanding. So if a player, you know, it's okay to have a coach lead a prevention program, but if the players don't understand why or don't have a big value in why they're doing it, then, you know, they may be staring at the sky or not talking, or, you know, like players aren't always going to pay attention to every drill anyway. So if they're just kind of going through the motions and not really doing the exercises well, then, well, are we really getting the whole benefit of that program? So helping the players themselves understand why they're doing it, I think helps with compliance as well. And then just having a regular structure can be helpful. So maybe you're not doing it every day, but, you know, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we're doing this program. Or Monday and Friday, we're doing the whole program. And then Wednesday, we're going to do only part of it in the beginning of training, and maybe we finish the rest in the end of training. Again, I think it comes back to identifying what are those obstacles and working with everybody involved to help overcome them.
Excellent. And the last question, watching the history of prevention injuries, several models have been trying to explain the reasoning of it. Maybe in the past we had the correlation causation model. Now we know that prevention is not easy is very complex. How we can connect the complexity of preventing injury in the application of prevention programs?
That's a great question. I think that's maybe a multi-million-dollar question, actually. I think we're learning so much about both, like you said, about the mechanisms, but also the mechanisms behind prevention. Dustin Grooms is a researcher in the US who's been doing a lot with looking at the brain. And are there actually differences in brain behavior prior to an ACL injury, as well as does engaging the brain more, so using motor learning techniques during prevention, help make those prevention programs more powerful? He's seen some good results using what he's calling augmented neuromuscular training, or using kind of more motor learning techniques. And in his case, also some VR technology to kind of help enhance some of those, we'll call them quote unquote traditional injury prevention programs. So I think there's a real exciting future for where we're headed when it comes to prevention. But pieces like that, thinking about, okay, how do we implement some motor learning within our injury prevention programs? Or how do we identify where our biggest need is? Is that in young men in high-risk sports? Is that in older, maybe amateur athletes? Identifying where that need is and starting to both focus implementation there, but also I think do research too. You don't have to be at a big university to do research, and making sure that if you're in a small club, or you're in a clinic, that you can still do a case study or a case series. Those can be really powerful in areas where we don't have a lot of literature. And so I think that's also another piece to remember as a clinician, that you can contribute to, not just by implementing, but also by making records of what you're doing, and then trying to and then publishing it. So yeah, that doesn't necessarily answer your question, but maybe I came around in a big circle.
Was an awesome answer. Thank you so much. So Amy, one more time, thank you so much. Thanks for your time. We know that you are a busy person, as I said before, living in a new country, so it's really complex. We really appreciate your effort. Every day we have the possibility to speak with a key opinion leader. Guys, if you want to follow Amy in social media, we leave her Twitter here. And of course, we will working on new activities with JOSPT in the future. Thank you, Amy. We hope to have you in Argentina in the future, maybe for our Congress or in other time, but we are really anxious to have you here in Argentina. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's really been a lot of fun.